Chapter 5, Genetics. Mendel and his peas. Early ideas about heredity. Have you ever mixed two paint colors to make a new color? Long ago, people thought an organism's characters or traits mixed like colors of paint because offspring resembled both parents. This is known as blending inheritance. Today, scientists know that heredity, the passing of traits from parents to offspring, is more complex. For example, you might have blue eyes, but both of your parents have brown eyes. How does this happen? More than 150 years ago, Gregor Mendel, an Australian monk, performed an experiment that helped answer these questions and disprove the idea of blending inheritance. Because of his research, Mendel is known as the father of genetics, the study of how traits are passed from parents to offspring. Mendel's experimental methods. During 1850s, Mendel studied genetics by doing controlled breeding experiments with pea plants. Pea plants were ideal for genetic studies because they reproduced quickly. They enabled Mendel to grow many plants and collect a lot of data. They have easily observed traits such as the flower color and pea shapes, and this enabled Mendel to observe whichever or not a trait was passed from one generation to the next. Mendel could control which pairs of plants reproduced. This enabled him to determine which traits came from which plant pairs. To observe how a trait was inherited, Mendel controlled which plants pollinated other plants. Pollination occurs when pollen lands on the pistil of a flower. Sperm cells from the pollen can occur in two ways. Self-pollination occurs when pollen from one plant lands on the pistil of a flower on the same plant as shown in Figure 1. Cross-pollination occurs when the pollen from one plant reaches the pistil of a flower on a different plant. Cross-pollination occurs naturally when wind or animals such as bees carry pollen from one flower to another. Mendel allowed one group of flowers to self-pollinate with another group. He cross-pollinated the plants himself. Mendel began his experiments with plants that were true breeding for the trait he would test. When a true breeding plant self-pollinates, it always produces offspring with traits that match the parent. For example, when a true pea plant with wrinkled seeds self-pollinates, it produces only plants with wrinkled seeds. In fact, plants with wrinkled seeds appeared generation after generation. By cross-pollinating plants himself, Mendel was able to select which plants pollinated other plants. Figure 2 shows an example of a manual cross between a plant with white flowers and one with purple flowers. Mendel cross-pollinated hundreds of plants for each set of traits, such as flower-colored purple or white, seed-colored green or yellow, and seed-shaped round or wrinkled. With each cross-pollination, Mendel recorded the traits that appeared in the offspring. By testing such a large number of plants, Mendel was able to predict which crosses would produce which traits. Mendel's results. Once Mendel had enough true breeding plants for a trait that he wanted to test, he cross-pollinated selected plants. His results are shown in Figure 3. First generation crosses, a cross between true breeding plants with purple flowers produced plants with only purple flowers. A cross between true breeding plants with white flowers produced plants with only white flowers, but something unexpected happened when Mendel crossed true breeding plants with purple flowers and true breeding plants with white flowers. All the offsprings had purple flowers. New questions raised. The results of the crosses between true breeding plants with purple flowers and true breeding plants with white flowers led to more questions for Mendel. Why did all the offsprings always had purple flowers? Why were there no white flowers? Why didn't Claudius produce offspring with pink flowers? Combination of the white and purple flowers. Mendel carried out more experiments with pea plants to answer these questions. Second generation hybrid crosses. The first generation purple flowers plants are called hybrid plants. This means they came from true breeding parent. Plants with different forms of same trait. Mendel wondered that what would happen if he cross-pollinated two flowering hybrid plants. As shown in figure 4, some of the offsprings had white flowers even though both parents had purple flowers. The results were similar each time. Mendel cross-pollinated two hybrid plants. The traits that had disappeared in the first generation always repeated in the second generation. The same result happened when Mendel cross-pollinated pea plants for other traits. For example, he found that cross-pollinating a true breeding yellow-seeded pea plant with a true breeding green-seeded pea plant always produced yellow-seeded hybrids. A second generation cross of two yellow-seeded hybrids always yield plants with yellow seeds and plants with green seeds. More hybrid crosses. Mendel counted the recorded traits of offspring from many experiments in which he cross-pollinated hybrid plants. Data from these experiments are shown in Table 1. He analyzed these data and noticed patterns. For example, from the data of crosses between hybrid plants with purple flowers, he found that the ratio of purple flowers to white flowers was about 3:1. This means purple flowering pea plants grew from the cross 3 times more often than white flowering plants grew from the cross. He calculated similar ratios for all 7 traits he tested. Mendel's conclusion. After analyzing the result of his experiments, Mendel concluded that 2 genetic factors control each inherited trait. He also proposed that when organisms reproduce, each reproductive cell, sperm, or egg contributes 1 factor for each trait. Dominant and recessive traits. Recall that when Mendel cross-pollinated a true breeding plant with purple flowers and a true breeding plant with white flowers, the hybrid offspring had only purple flowers. Mendel hypothesized that the hybrid offspring had 1 genetic factor for purple flowers and 1 genetic factor for white flowers. But why were there no white flowers? Mendel also hypothesized that the purple factor is the only factor seen or expressed because it blocks the white factor. A genetic factor that blocks another genetic factor is called a dominant trait. A dominant trait, such as purple pea flowers, is observed when offsprings have either one of the 2 dominant factors. A genetic factor that is blocked by the presence of a dominant factor is called recessive trait. A recessive trait, such as white pea flowers, is observed only when 2 recessive genetic factors are present in offspring, from parents to second generation. For the second generation, Mendel cross-pollinated 2 hybrids with purple flowers. About 75% of the second generation plants had purple flowers. These plants had at least 1 dominant factor. 25% of the second generation plants had white flowers. These plants had the same 2 recessive factors.